She snapped her fingers at me like I was her personal servant. The sound echoed across the small cafe, cutting through the morning rush chatter. I looked up from the espresso machine, steam still hissing around my hand, and saw her leaning over the pastry display case with that entitled smirk. "Hey, you," she said, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "Smile more. Customers shouldn't look so miserable." My jaw tightened. The nerve of this woman was incredible. I'd been working at Corner Cafe for 2 years, and I knew the rules better than anyone. Customers weren't allowed behind the counter, period. Health codes, insurance liability, basic common sense. "Ma'am, customers aren't permitted behind the counter," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "It's a health violation." Her grin turned cold and calculating. She slid back around to the customer side and immediately wrapped her arms around my manager, Damari, planting a dramatic kiss on his cheek. The whole display was clearly meant for my benefit. Damari's eyes met mine over her shoulder, and he smirked. That look told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to say anything to her. He was going to let this slide because she was his girlfriend. My stomach dropped as I realized what I'd just walked into. The schedule notification hit my phone at exactly 9:04 p.m. that night. I was at home, finally relaxing after a long shift, when the When I Work app pinged. The sound usually didn't bother me, but something about the timing felt ominous. I opened the app and stared at the screen in disbelief. 12 hours, down from my usual 40 hours per week. My rent payment laughed mockingly in my head as I calculated how little money this would bring in. My fingers shook as I typed out a text to Damari. "Is this schedule a mistake? I'm usually at 40 hours. The 3 dots appeared immediately, like he'd been waiting for my message. Then his response popped up. "No mistake. Consider it a reset for your attitude problem." I read the message 3 times before it sank in. This wasn't about scheduling conflicts or business being slow. This was retaliation, pure and simple. He was punishing me for standing up to his girlfriend. My throat burned with the injustice of it all. I'd worked my tail off for this place for 2 years. I'd covered shifts, stayed late, dealt with difficult customers with patience and professionalism. And this was how I was being repaid. A reset. Right. More like a declaration of war. The next morning, Damari called me into the tiny back office. The space was cramped, with a humming mini fridge in the corner, and the smell of cinnamon syrup permanently embedded in the air. I could feel the sticky residue under my palm as I placed my hand on the desk. "You disrespected Faye yesterday," he said, his tone official and cold, like he was reading from a policy manual. "That kind of behavior is unacceptable." "She's a customer," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. I was enforcing health code regulations that protect everyone. "She's my partner," he corrected sharply, "and you need to learn your place in this establishment." The word place hit me like a physical blow. It hung in the air between us, heavy with implied hierarchy and power dynamics. He wasn't talking about my job position. He was talking about my worth as a human being. I stood up slowly, refusing to let him see how much his words had affected me. My hands were trembling slightly, but I kept my voice steady. "Understood," I said simply. I walked out of that office without crying, but it was a close thing. The injustice of the situation was overwhelming, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I worked my drastically reduced shift like a ghost moving through the motions. Every task felt surreal. Wiping down bar towels, refilling milk pitchers, cleaning the sticky blender that never seemed to get completely clean. The familiar routine felt foreign now, tainted by the knowledge of how little I was valued here. Faye perched on a stool just inside the bar rail, picking at a croissant with her chipped black nail polish. She acted like she owned the place, giving me orders in a sickeningly sweet voice that dripped with false authority. "His latte needs more foam," she instructed, not even looking up from her phone. "And make sure the temperature is perfect this time." I bit my tongue and made the drink exactly how Damari always ordered it. But I also pulled out a receipt and wrote down the time, date, and her exact words. If this was going to be an ongoing battle, I needed documentation. Evidence tastes like paper when you're gathering it with shaking hands, but I folded that receipt and tucked it safely in my apron pocket. Every interaction was now potential ammunition, and I was going to be ready. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about dignity and respect, and I wasn't going down without a fight. During a quiet moment, I remembered the guest feedback notebook we kept under the register. It was one of those spiral-bound books where customers could leave compliments or complaints. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now I was curious. I slid it open carefully, using a napkin to avoid leaving fingerprints. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 separate entries, all dated within the past week, all complaining about the brunette girl behind the counter who isn't even staff, being rude to customers. The entries were detailed with specific times and dates. They described interactions that had never happened, complaints about service I'd never provided. The handwriting looked suspiciously similar across all 3 entries, though the names were different. I pulled out my phone and took photos of each page, making sure the timestamp and lighting were clear. The espresso machine hissed in the background, its steady drip providing a rhythmic soundtrack to my discovery. If Damari thought he could build a case against me using fake customer complaints, he was about to learn how wrong he was. 2 could play the documentation game, and I was about to become very good at it. The evidence was mounting, and not in his favor. Our security system consisted of 2 cameras, one pointed at the main lobby area and another focused on the bar area where we prepared drinks. The DVR unit was tucked under the point-of-sale terminal, right next to where we stored the oat milk. At closing time, while I was sweeping the floor, I knelt down and popped open the panel. The serial number was clearly visible, along with timestamps showing the system was recording properly. I took several photos, making sure to capture the technical details that would matter later. But the real prize was what I found in the stored footage. I managed to grab a still image of Faye sitting behind the counter in her open-toed sandals, clearly violating health code regulations. Her feet were visible, her casual clothing obvious, and the timestamp proved she'd been in a restricted area. My hands were steady as I took the photos, but my heart was racing. This was concrete evidence of health violations, and it was time-stamped and documented. Damari might have thought his girlfriend was above the rules, but the health department would have a different opinion. I saved everything to my personal cloud storage and made backup copies. If this situation escalated, I wanted to be prepared. That night, I went home and opened my laptop. My Google search history became a crash course in employment law. State labor law retaliation, reduced hours, unpaid supervisors in food service, health code violations in restaurants, trespassing in food preparation areas. I wasn't a lawyer, just a broke barista with righteous anger and an internet connection. But I was determined to understand my rights and the regulations that were supposed to protect both employees and customers. At the local library, I printed out relevant statutes and regulations, highlighting key passages like I was studying for a final exam. I organized everything into a folder that I labeled Cafe, Policies and Violations. The weight of the paper felt reassuring in my hands. Labor law was more complicated than I'd expected, but the basics were clear. Retaliation for reporting health violations was illegal. Allowing unauthorized people in food preparation areas was a serious violation. Cutting someone's hours as punishment for following policy was textbook retaliation. I was building a case, piece by piece, and I was starting to feel like I might actually have a chance of winning this fight. Knowledge, as they say, is power. The next morning during the rush, I approached Mr. Jones, the cafe owner, during his usual coffee refill. He was a quiet man in his 60s who seemed tired lately, older than he had just a month ago. He'd always been fair with employees, and I hoped he still was. "Mr. Jones, could I show you something important?" I whispered, making sure Damari couldn't overhear from across the cafe. He looked up from his newspaper, his expression weary but attentive. "Make it quick, honey. What's on your mind?" I handed him the folder I'd compiled, watching his face carefully as he opened it. He didn't react to the legal statutes or the documentation of my hour reduction. But when he reached the photo of Faye sitting on the prep counter in violation of health codes, his entire demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, and he looked up at me with sharp eyes that suddenly seemed much more alert. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the photo like he was memorizing every detail. "I see," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." He closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. His expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't going to be ignored. Mr. Jones called Damari into the back office, and I found myself suddenly very busy restocking supplies near the doorway. The voices were muffled, but I could hear the serious tone of the conversation, even if I couldn't make out specific words. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone's voice rose slightly before dropping back to a whisper. The conversation went on for nearly 15 minutes while I pretended to organize coffee filters and count stirring sticks. When the door finally opened, Damari emerged with a face like a thundercloud. His eyes immediately found mine across the cafe, and the look he gave me was flat and cold, like a dead computer screen. "We'll talk later," he said as he walked past me, and every word dripped with menace. The threat was clear in his tone. He wasn't planning a friendly conversation about work policies. He was planning retaliation, and he wanted me to know it was coming. My stomach turned to cold coffee, but I kept working. If he wanted to escalate the situation, I was ready. I had documentation, evidence, and now I had Mr. Jones's attention. Let him try his worst. The next move was his. But I had a feeling it wouldn't be his best. The promised later came as a text message that evening. "Lose the attitude or lose your weekends too. Last warning." I immediately took a screenshot, making sure the location metadata and timestamp were captured. Then I watched as he made another move in our escalating chess game. He added Faye to the staff group chat as a volunteer supervisor with a winking emoji. The group chat exploded with activity. I could see multiple people typing, the little bubble indicators appearing and disappearing as my coworkers started and stopped responses. But no one actually sent any messages. The silence was deafening. Everyone knew this was wrong, but no one wanted to be the next target. I understood their fear, but I also saved screenshots of the entire conversation thread, including the timestamp showing when she was added and Damari's casual emoji use. He was making mistakes now, leaving a digital paper trail that would be impossible to deny later. Each threat, each violation, each abuse of his position was being documented in real time. Paper cuts can kill if you accumulate enough of them, and I was collecting quite a pile. Damari was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The lunch rush brought its usual chaos, and that's when things finally came to a head. A delivery driver knocked over a box of coffee cups near the entrance, sending them scattering across the floor. Faye, who was lounging on her usual stool behind the counter, stepped around the mess and pointed at me. "Clean that up," she barked, "and make sure you get all the pieces." Something inside me snapped. I'd had enough of being ordered around by someone who had no authority and no business being in the work area. "You don't give me directives," I said clearly, not raising my voice but making sure everyone in the cafe could hear me. The entire place seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The espresso machine hissed into sudden silence. Even the delivery driver paused in his cleanup to watch what would happen next. Faye's smirk widened. "I do now," she said, enjoying the audience. I looked directly at the security camera, then back at her. "Step behind that counter line again," I said calmly, "and you'll be leaving with someone who isn't me." The implication was clear. The health department, not Damari, would be escorting her out. The threat hung in the air like steam from the espresso machine. During my break, I sat in my car and dialed the health department hotline. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I was past the point of nervousness and into the realm of cold determination. "I'd like to report a hypothetical situation," I said when the inspector answered. "If someone who wasn't an employee was regularly in a restaurant's food preparation area, what would be the proper procedure?" The inspector's voice became immediately serious. "That's not hypothetical for long. Can you provide the establishment's address?" I gave them the cafe's information, along with specific dates and times when violations had occurred. They thanked me for caring about public safety and said an inspector would be in touch with the business soon. After I hung up, I watched through the cafe window as Faye touched the muffin tongs with her bare hands and then ran those same hands through her hair. The health violation was happening in real time, and soon there would be official consequences. I didn't have to imagine what would happen next. I knew exactly what was coming, and Damari was going to be completely unprepared for it. The wheels of bureaucracy were slow, but they were finally turning in my favor. That evening, Mr. Jones returned to the cafe alone. He stood by the pastry case, watching the way the pendant lights reflected off the crumbs scattered across the glass surface. His expression was thoughtful and troubled. "Is it true she's been near the cash register unsupervised?" he asked quietly, not looking directly at me. I chose my words carefully. I didn't see her take anything directly, but I did see Damari leave her alone by the register multiple times. His face seemed to fold in on itself, showing more grief than anger. I realized this wasn't just about business for him. This was personal. "This place was my wife's before she passed," he said softly, his voice heavy with memory. "We always did things properly here. She insisted on it." He wasn't asking me for information anymore. He was remembering why standards mattered, why rules existed, why his wife had built this place with such care and attention to detail. "I understand," I said simply. He nodded once, still staring at the pastry case. "Good, because we're going to keep doing things properly." The promise in his voice was unmistakable. Change was coming, and it was going to be thorough. I arrived early the next morning with a new strategy. Instead of waiting for problems to escalate, I was going to present solutions. I offered to help Mr. Jones run a complete inventory check, showing him the shrinkage patterns week by week. Numbers don't lie, and they don't cry either. The data was stark and undeniable. Inventory shortages had increased significantly since Faye started spending time at the cafe. The timeline was clear, the amounts were documented, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Mr. Jones stared at the spreadsheets I'd prepared, his jaw working silently as he processed the information. The shortage curve rose like a tide chart, perfectly correlating with Faye's frequent visits. "I'll handle this," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of a solemn promise. I believed him, but I also didn't entirely trust that Damari wouldn't find a way to make this my fault somehow. I'd learned not to assume anything would go smoothly in this situation. Still, having the owner on my side felt like a significant victory. Mr. Jones was a man who valued integrity, and the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The tide was finally turning, but I knew the storm wasn't over yet. Saturday morning brought the usual chaos. Lines out the door, parents juggling strollers and coffee orders, the general mayhem of weekend rush. That's when Faye decided to make her boldest move yet. She slipped behind the counter again, acting like she belonged there. But this time, I was ready for her. I stepped directly into her path, blocking her access to the register and prep area. "You can't be here," I said calmly but firmly. "For your safety and ours, customers need to stay in the designated areas." Instead of backing down, she raised her voice, clearly trying to create a scene. "This is ridiculous. You're just bitter help." The entire cafe turned to watch the confrontation. But instead of supporting her, I heard a mom with a toddler speak up from the line. "She's absolutely right. You need to get out of there." For the first time since this whole mess started, I saw uncertainty flicker across Faye's face. She'd expected the customers to side with her, but they understood basic health and safety rules better than she did. Other voices chimed in, agreeing that she didn't belong behind the counter. The public support was overwhelming, and Faye found herself facing a room full of people who sided with the bitter help instead of her. She retreated, but the damage to her confidence was visible. 2 days later, an email appeared in my inbox that changed everything. The sender was listed as HR for the parent company that handled our payroll and employee management. "We have received an anonymous report regarding potential retaliation involving reduced hours and hostile work environment issues," the email read. "Please provide a written statement detailing your experiences, including any relevant documentation." My heart started racing as I realized someone else had reported the situation. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Someone with actual authority was paying attention. I spent 2 hours crafting my response, writing it like a witness statement rather than an emotional plea. I attached every photo, screenshot, and document I'd collected. The evidence told the story better than my words ever could. I ended my statement with one simple line. I want my hours restored and the workplace violations addressed. This isn't about revenge, it's about fair treatment and proper procedures. That was both a lie and the truth. I did want my hours back, but after everything Damari had put me through, a small part of me definitely wanted to see him face consequences. The corporate machinery was finally engaged, and I was ready for whatever came next. Damari tried a different approach when he realized the situation was escalating beyond his control. He pulled me aside with what he probably thought was a charming smile. "Look, let's just reset this whole thing," he said, his tone artificially friendly. "I can give you a couple more shifts to help you out." I maintained a neutral expression, but inside I was celebrating. He was trying to fix the situation, which meant he was worried about the consequences. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but could you put that offer in writing? And could you clarify that the original hour reduction wasn't disciplinary?" His smile faltered slightly, but he was committed to the performance now. "Sure, no problem." He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "Your recent hours change wasn't disciplinary action. We can discuss adding shifts." I took screenshots immediately, capturing the admission that my hours had been cut for non-disciplinary reasons. If it wasn't disciplinary and it wasn't based on business needs, then it was retaliation. He'd just confirmed exactly what I needed him to confirm. "Perfect," I said, smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. "Thank you for clarifying that." At 10:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, everything changed. Two health inspectors walked through the front door with clipboards and serious expressions. They wore official badges and had the unmistakable authority of government oversight. Faye was sitting on her usual stool behind the counter when they entered. The lead inspector, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, looked directly at her. "Ma'am, are you employed by this establishment?" she asked. Faye, caught off guard by the directness of the question, stammered. "Kind of. I mean, I help out sometimes." "Could you please step outside the service area and remain in the customer zones only?" the inspector said firmly. Damari's face went white as he realized what was happening. When the inspectors asked to see food safety certifications for all personnel who had access to prep areas, they couldn't produce any documentation. She didn't have a food handler's permit. She wasn't on the employee roster. She had no legitimate reason to be behind the counter. And now it was being documented by official inspectors. The write-up they produced was quiet but devastating. Health code violations, unauthorized personnel in food prep areas, inadequate supervision of food safety protocols. Damari stood frozen as they handed him the official citation, his confident smirk replaced by barely controlled panic. Mr. Jones asked me to step outside with him after the inspectors left. His face was a mixture of embarrassment and fury, but the anger wasn't directed at me. "I didn't know the extent of what was happening," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought she was just good for him. I didn't realize she was violating health codes." He looked like a man who'd discovered a fundamental breach of trust in something he held sacred. His wife's cafe, the business they'd built together, had been compromised by carelessness and favoritism. "I need a witness when I talk to Damari," he continued. "Someone who can verify the facts." My pulse was steady now, calmer than it had been in weeks. "I'll bring copies of all the policies and documentation," I offered. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Good, and I'll bring a locksmith." The implication was clear. There were going to be immediate changes to who had access to what. Damari's reign of casual rule-breaking was about to end abruptly. Justice was finally moving at the speed of business necessity rather than personal politics. The point-of-sale system audit came back with disturbing findings. There had been irregular, no-sale transactions during times when Faye was present in the store, drawer openings that didn't correspond to actual sales or legitimate business needs. The tip jar security camera had captured footage of her fingers brushing against the bills, though it wasn't clear if anything had actually been taken. It wasn't definitive proof of theft, but it was highly suspicious behavior from someone who had no business being near the cash at all. Jones set the audit report on the office desk like he was placing a tombstone. The weight of the evidence was undeniable now. This wasn't just about health violations or inappropriate behavior. There were potential financial irregularities, too. When Damari walked into the office and saw the stack of papers, he laughed. But it was too loud, too forced, the kind of laugh that strangled itself halfway out. "You seriously think she needs your tip money?" he said, but his voice cracked slightly. The laugh died completely when Mr. Jones opened the folder and showed him the actual numbers. Financial discrepancies aren't funny, especially when they're documented and time-stamped. Damari's confident facade finally began to crumble. That's when Damari made his most desperate move. He slid a pre-written document across the desk to me, a mutual non-disparagement agreement that would prevent either of us from saying anything negative about the other. The document came with a schedule showing my hours bumped up to 18 per week, as if that was supposed to be generous. I read through the legal language carefully, noting what it implied about wrongdoing and liability. "You forgot to include severance," I said with a smile. "This document implies there was wrongdoing that needs to be covered up. I'll be happy to sign a non-disparagement agreement if you restore my full 40 hours, provide back pay for the differential, and include me in the shift supervisor training program." Damari stared at me like I'd grown a second head. He'd expected me to be grateful for the small increase and eager to make the problem go away quietly. "I'm not expensive," I continued. "I'm just exact about what's fair." I held his gaze steadily, letting him know that I wasn't going to be bought off cheaply or intimidated into settling for less than what I deserved. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and he was finally beginning to understand that. HR's response to my detailed complaint arrived like a bombshell. The email was formal, direct, and copied to people whose names I recognized as being much higher up the corporate food chain than Damari. "We have significant concerns about the management conduct described in your complaint," the email read. "Please do not sign any additional documents presented by store management pending our investigation." They'd copied Mr. Jones on the email. They'd copied the regional manager. They'd copied someone from the legal department whose title I didn't even recognize. I immediately forwarded the email to my personal account and printed 3 copies, folding one carefully into my apron pocket like a protective talisman. The corporate cavalry had finally arrived, and they were taking the situation seriously. Damari's attempts to control the narrative and manage the damage had failed spectacularly. Instead of containing a small workplace dispute, his retaliation had escalated the situation into a formal investigation involving multiple levels of management and potentially the legal department. The small cafe dispute had become a corporate incident, and Damari was no longer in control of how it would be resolved. The next morning, Faye tried to enter the cafe like nothing had changed, but the locksmith had been there at dawn, and the key codes had all been updated overnight. When she tried to slip behind the counter, the new access panel beeped red and refused to let her through. She looked confused and slightly offended, as if the technology was somehow malfunctioning. Mr. Jones met her at the door with a formal document in his hand. "Ma'am, you're no longer allowed in food preparation areas," he said calmly. "This is an official trespass notice regarding health code violations." She tried to argue, saying she was just there to see Damari, but he pointed to the health inspector's report that was now posted behind glass near the entrance. The official citations were visible to every customer who walked through the door. Faye left with a glare that I felt between my shoulder blades all day. But she left. The physical barrier of the new security system made it impossible for her to continue her previous behavior. For the first time in weeks, I could work my shift without worrying about inappropriate interference or violated policies. The cafe felt lighter somehow, like someone had finally opened the windows and let fresh air circulate. At 3:10 p.m., Mr. Jones called an all-staff meeting. There was no fanfare, no dramatic build-up, just a simple announcement that we needed to gather in the main seating area. "I'm suspending Damari pending a full investigation," he said without preamble, effective immediately. He handed me a set of keys, access to the back office, the safe, and the shift supervisor handbook. The weight of the metal was surprisingly substantial in my palm. "We do things properly here," he said, using the same words he'd spoken before, but they carried more weight now. They felt real, backed by action rather than just intention. I accepted the keys with steady hands, though I noticed his were trembling slightly. This wasn't easy for him either. Damari had been a manager he'd trusted, and discovering that trust had been misplaced was clearly painful. "Thank you," I said simply. The promotion felt surreal after weeks of having my hours cut and my authority undermined. But it also felt earned, justified by everything I'd endured and documented along the way. A week later, the new schedule was posted with my name listed as acting shift supervisor at 40 hours per week, plus a $1.50 raise. HR had confirmed that I would receive back pay for all the hours that had been cut in retaliation. Damari never returned to the cafe. According to Mr. Jones, he'd submitted his resignation rather than face the formal investigation. The corporate review had found multiple policy violations and had recommended termination anyway. The workspace felt completely different now. Lighter, more professional, focused on actual customer service rather than personal drama. When a customer asked where the previous manager had gone, I tamped down a perfect espresso shot and caught my reflection in the chrome machine. "Management made a better choice," I said simply. The espresso ran honey thick and steady, exactly the way it was supposed to. Like closure, it took time to develop properly, but the result was worth the wait. I'd learned that standing up for yourself isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. Sometimes the people who try to make you feel small are the ones who need to learn the biggest lessons. And sometimes, if you document everything and refuse to back down, justice actually works the way it's supposed to.